Can everybody hear me? Yes, you can, I think. Anyway, good afternoon, everybody. First of all, thank you for coming and managing to get here in spite of current relations on the industrialist scene. Big disappointment for Railway and Canal Historical Society, because we had expected to get a good crowd for this meeting, but unfortunately with the rail strike it's gone by the board. But anyway, my name, for those that, I think most of you know me, but for those that don't, my name is Gerald Leach, and I am currently the president of the Railway and Canal Historical Society. So I would like to welcome you to the Clinker Lecture for 2023. Before commencing, I need to just give you the usual housekeeping notices. The exits are right and left, or your left and right. There will be an alarm if anything happens. We hope it doesn't. I asked whether it was a bell or a horn, but the young lady who was speaking said it's a noise and you won't you will hear it definitely. So you evacuate through either of those and go outside the building. So I don't think there's going to be a big crush, and I hope there isn't. That isn't called for. If you've not already found the toilets, they are out of that door on that side, and you'll see them facing you in the block of doors opposite. Finally, before we get round to introducing the speaker, could I please ask anybody who hasn't already done so and have got a mobile phone to ensure that it is switched off. Well, as this is a Clinker lecture, I thought perhaps I should say something about Charles Clinker. And pardon me if I read it. He was born in 1906, and in 1923, at the age of 17, he became an employee of the Great Western Railway, and he remained in their employment until 1946. Railways were always his hobby, and he became a railway historian and chronologer. He wrote many articles about railways for magazines and was the author of a number of historical railway books, particularly those that focused on early railways. His register of closed passenger and goods stations in England, Scotland and Wales was a pioneering work of railway chronology, but has subsequently been superseded by later works published as a result of additional individual research, which is still ongoing. Charles Clinker was also responsible for starting and amassing the Locomotive and General Railway photographic collection, now held by the National Railway Museum here in York. His underlying philosophy of historical research was to use original source materials and strive for accuracy. He is one of the 6 founding members of the Railway and Canal Historical Society, which was established in Preston in 1954. So next year is one of our anniversary years. Following his death in 1983, in recognition of his lifetime research of railway history, the Railway and Canal Historical Society took the decision to promote and organise an annual lecture, which in his honour would be named the Clinker Memorial Lecture. So here we are today for the Clinker Memorial. I'd now like to introduce our speaker for today, John Nelson. John is also a career railwayman, beginning in 1968 and spent in both the public and private sectors. He led British Railways Eastern Region from 1987 to 1992, and until privatisation of railways in 1997, was the managing director of Network South East, which at that time was British Rail's largest business. In the private sector, he went on to promote open access operating companies, Hull Trains, and the Wrexham and Shropshire Railway. For a number of years, he was a non-executive director of Lang's Rail, which operated Chiltern Railways and London Overground, and the Tyne and Wear Metro. He established several businesses, including Railway Consultants First Class Partnerships, and was also on the board of the Leeds-based Transit plc, supplying the rail sector with a variety of technology-based planning and monitoring tools. In 2019, he published a book entitled Losing Track, an insider story of Britain's railway transformation from British Rail to the present day. The title for John's lecture today is Not So Open Access. John Nelson.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for inviting me to deliver what I think is a prestigious lecture of this society. Unfortunately, there are not as many people here as I think we'd all have wished, and I think we know that the principal reason for that, unfortunately, is the ongoing union dispute with, today I think, with ASLEF. I could recount many occasions in the past when disputes with ASLEF have affected my own life. I can remember back in the early 80s when there was a major dispute involving ASLEF over a productivity deal called flexible rostering. Do you remember that? It was probably the biggest rail strike there had ever been in railway history, apart from the general strike. And I spent 3 weeks sleeping on a camp bed in the office in London. So I've never really forgotten that experience. Today is described as an address, and I'm going to deliver it as an address. I would normally not do that. I would normally do it probably in a fairly chatty, informal manner. But I think because of the importance of it, I have decided in the end to do it as an address. And I hope you'll be comfortable with that experience. And I hope you'll enjoy what I've got to talk about. There are no illustrations, so you'll just have to, apart from myself, so you'll just have to fix your gaze on me, or if you don't want to do that, just go to sleep. So I was fascinated to discover that part of Charles Clinker's career with the Great Western coincided with that of my great-grandfather, Isaac, who retired in 1938. Amongst my earliest memories are the tours of Paddington he would arrange in the early 1950s when I would visit his gaslit home in Kensal Green, hard by both the Great Western Main Line and the Grand Union Canal. In fact, the houses my great-grandparents occupied when they met in the 1880s both adjoined the canal path, close to the bridge that links Ladbroke Grove with the Harrow Road. If you know London, you'll know that pretty well. That railways sooner and canals later came to be important elements of my life, and that they remain so to this day, is due in no small measure to my great-grandfather's influence. His pride in being a GWR man is a memory that has stuck. His loyalty to a company that to this day bears its name defined him as a railwayman. A photograph that occupies prominent wall space in my home shows him on retirement day, immaculate and proud, in his uniform as the company's chief claims inspector. When Hull Trains was established over 80 years later, these were the qualities we made the cornerstones of the company's culture. First, though, I must explain the background to the creation of Hull Trains, which I claim to be the first genuinely new mainline passenger railway to have been established since the Great Central in 1899. I discount companies that acquired the franchises let after privatisation, as they inherited services that already existed. Those businesses were already well established. Risk lay not so much in the operation as in the nature of the bid and the bids that other people made. Open access was the term adopted in the 1993 Railways Act to differentiate non-franchise services from those that operated under government agreements after 1995. Franchising was all done by 97 and signified that BR's privatisation had been completed. The separation of train from track was a central feature of privatisation. The reason for that controversial separation was a belief that to have a genuinely private system, it was necessary to encourage competition between rival companies. It was deemed, I've gone on, what's happened here? It was deemed necessary because a company that owned both track and train would be likely to use its control of assets to exercise a discriminatory influence over any potential upstart competitor. There was good reason for this. The earliest history of railways is full of examples. And even within BR, after the creation of sectors in the 1980s, there were suspicions that a route's main operator could use its dominance to harm smaller ones, especially where track capacity was limited. As privatisation approached, and there was initially little appetite to enter the new field of railway franchising, nervousness about on-track competition became an issue. The form of competition that developed was between companies at the franchise bidding stage, not after one had been awarded. If an open access operator could challenge a franchise and risk its future revenues, especially in a market that at the time was largely unknown to most bidders, not only was there potential to put companies off bidding, but also a possibility that the value to the government of selling a franchise could be devalued. Neither of these prospects was attractive to a government whose time in office was fading. Its imperative was to dispose of the whole of BR before a general election that was due at the latest in May 1997. The early privatisation processes had already consumed 3 years, and franchise competition did not commence until 1995. There were consequences for open access. In fact, access was very restricted. Firstly, it couldn't start until the whole railway had been franchised on terms that gave the new owners confidence in their investment. Secondly, the government was mostly concerned about the impact of bids on its levels of subsidy to the industry, and so open access itself was subject to restrictions. These came partly in the form of timetable specifications that consumed track capacity, but more obviously in the form of a rule known as the moderation of competition, enforceable by the rail regulator. A franchise operator could nominate traffic flows to be protected from competition if in combination their value exceeded a given percentage of the company's total. The then policy allowed alternative operators to cater for flows that made up no more than 20% of a franchise operator's revenue. It was acknowledged that the level of protection would be reduced over time, but initially the bar was too high to make open access attractive on most routes. Additionally, market entry was restricted because practically all traction and rolling stock had been let to the new franchises in contracts with the leasing companies also established by the 1993 Act. Any operator intent on open access would therefore need to invest in new stock, a major impediment to early market entry. Franchising itself was the main investment opportunity at that time. So how did Hull Trains come about in this unpropitious market situation? There were 4 reasons, each with an individual or individuals with different motivations behind it, but who came to coalesce. The individuals were me and Mike Jones, both retirees from BR, effectively redundant in 1997, a group of free market Canadians who were the initiators of a new AIM-listed company called GB Railways, created specifically to exploit privatisation, and Tom Windsor, the first rail regulator whose remit included an obligation to promote competition. I'll start with Mike Jones. Mike and I both joined BR's management training scheme in 1968. Our paths crossed a bit after that, but although friendly, we would not have been described as soulmates. Mike was a committed Conservative, active at national level, and in Prime Minister John Major's Huntingdon constituency, where he lived. A massive proponent of railway privatisation, Mike had become something of an irritant at senior levels in the BRB, but was very influential outside it. In 1997, Mike and I set out to follow different paths. Both approaching 50 then, we could have retired, but we were far too young to head for the fishing lakes. Mike had been involved in an unsuccessful bid for the Great Western franchise and was determined to get back into the fray. I had embarked on what is known as a portfolio career, establishing the First Trust Partnerships Consultancy, becoming chairman of the North Yorkshire Ambulance Service NHS Trust, and working for Railtrack as sponsor of London's major rail projects, Heathrow Express, Crossrail, and Thameslink. Out of the blue one day in 1998, I got a call from Mike asking if I would be interested in looking at open access. He was in discussion with lenders who thought that for an application to succeed, the owner needed to demonstrate operational credibility. My recent post as General Manager of the Eastern Region and of Managing Director of Network South East seemed to tick this box. So we met in York, and Mike explained how he thought an application to the regulator to launch an open access operation between London and Nottingham via the East Coast Main Line was an attractive option. It would compete with the then National Express Midland Line franchise by offering a speedier service. Although I was sceptical of the form of privatisation that had been chosen by the government, I may even have surprised myself when I told Mike that yes, I was up for it. My attitude was, the government has embarked on this path. We can show them what privatisation could be about, entrepreneurial and risk-taking. An improbable alliance was formed, and we joined forces in a company called Renaissance Trains. We settled on operations to Hull and Sheffield rather than to Nottingham. I was especially keen on Sheffield, where I had been British Rail passenger manager in the early 80s and had become deeply frustrated when the launch of HSTs on the East Coast Main Line occasioned a substantial loss of traffic from Sheffield St Pancras services being diverted to Doncaster. Worse was BR's then decision to refuse the deployment of HSTs to principal business trains between the Steel City and London. I loved Sheffield and felt that even with the subsequent reversal of BR's HST strategy, it still got a raw deal. I felt the same about Hull, which had only one service in each direction to and from London. It too was a marginalised city, victim of a cost minimisation strategy forced on British Rail by the constricting noose of its finances in the aftermath of Geoffrey Howe's first budget after the election of the Thatcher government in 1979. I was also aware that the creation of the East Coast diversion to avoid the then newly operational Selby coalfield had eliminated direct London services from that town and its surrounding quite wealthy hinterland. Stopping trains there would generate new business. I was attracted by the idea that we could show them how it should be done, and that we could do so to benefit less advantaged communities. Much of BR's intercity strategy was based on optimizing the business market and was very definitely not focused on working-class cities like Hull and Sheffield. Initially, we developed the idea of serving both Hull and Sheffield via the East Coast Main Line, with trains dividing at either Newark or Retford, and using the curve at that location to access South Yorkshire via Worksop. Using comparative data on intercity traffic flows to London and relating these to the population catchments of the two large cities, we developed a business plan based on a limited number of trains per day. We used our own local knowledge of the East Coast route to provide common sense timetable options, and were convinced, it slipped, that the track capacity was more than sufficient for our purposes. Informal discussions commenced with Railtrack. Traction rolling stock were our biggest problem. The only stock available had been built for use through the Channel Tunnel and for onward travel to regional destinations beyond London. We entered discussions with the owners, London and Continental Railways, and developed a plan using our demand-based revenue estimates and the costings we were able to construct for rolling stock and access charges. It became rapidly apparent that the traction and rolling stock costs alone rendered a commercial operation impossible. Initially, we were stumped, but reckoned that if we could get hold of lightweight stock, we could make a go of it. With our knowledge of the new world of franchise owners, the realization dawned that if we could climb on the back of a new build order placed as a result of a successful franchise award, we could probably crack the problem. So GB Railways emerged as the preferred partner. That company had been established specifically to take advantage of privatization and was a good fit with our own. Their limited success in franchising meant that they'd only succeeded in acquiring one operation, Anglia, effectively Liverpool Street, Norwich, and their plans to procure new Class 170 diesel multiple units to double the service frequency meant that an opportunity existed. And this became the basis of negotiations that ended with the creation of a joint venture company. Meanwhile, our plans for Sheffield incurred furious defensive action from National Express to protect their traffic, and they changed the Midland mainline flows that they had initially nominated to be protected. They did so by the simple device of switching Bedford-St Pancras from protected to unprotected, and nominating Sheffield from unprotected to protected. This stymied our plans and forced the evaluation of an operation that served Hull only. It still looked feasible, but would take longer to make a financial return. Hull Trains was incorporated in February 1999. Our attention turned to the regulator as we moved to secure a track access agreement with Railtrack. Even with hindsight, it has to be said that they, Railtrack, were less than accommodating. We were seen as an irritant compared with the much grander GNER, and both took steps to frustrate our ambitions. Railtrack argued there was insufficient route capacity. I need hardly say that the explosion of new services on the route in subsequent years proved that this was either a reflection of their unwillingness to support open access or of ineptitude. I thought it was both. At the time, I felt they and GNER were in lockstep together. We would encounter similar obstacles a few years later in the planning of services from Wrexham and Shrewsbury. Mike and I expected opposition from GNER, but developed a proposal that we thought was win-win. It would have involved GNER subcontracting the operation of their solitary hull service to us, enabling them to deploy an additional HST set to longer distance, higher revenue earning services, which we knew they wanted to do. We met Christopher Garnett, then GNER's managing director, in what turned out to be my old office as general manager, now a suite in York's only city centre five-star hotel. The business discussion was brief, with legal action being immediately threatened against us. We finished our coffee and left in short order. The next step was a regulatory hearing in London, which Tom Windsor opened personally. There were 4 parties represented: Hull Trains, Railtrack, GNER, and West Anglia Great Northern, or WAGON, the latter because they had meanwhile applied to use train paths to Doncaster as an open access extension of their own London Peterborough services. GNER had also by now adopted an expansion strategy designed partly to block competition. They proposed additional services to York, ironically initially utilising the Channel tunnel stock that was more suitable for them than it was for us. Meanwhile, Railtrack's suspect position on East Coast Main Line capacity was fully exposed. Part of their objection to Hull trains was based on limited platform capacity at King's Cross. But when it emerged that some GNER empty stock was platformed there for hours on end, their stance was completely undermined. Nevertheless, the outcome for us was not ideal. The regulator ruled that providing at least 3 paths per day for the proposed Hull services offered wider social and economic benefit than the alternative bids. However, the available train paths would be shared with GNER, but at least Wagon was off the pitch, and we had the opportunity to get going. The regulator also decreed that within 2 years, we would need to supply 125 compatible trains and release the lower performing 170s for humbler purposes. We were delighted with this outcome, as such an investment cleared the way for a longer track access agreement and higher revenues. A procurement contract for the acquisition of new build 125 stock was agreed with the Porterbrook Leasing Company. The Class 222 Pathfinders, they were called, were a derivative of the successful Virgin Voyager. In the end, we got 10 years to September 2010, a time frame in which we could develop and enhance our services. Projected annual revenues are forecast to double, and we plan to move maintenance from Anglia's Crown Point depot at Norwich to Crofton near Wakefield. Meanwhile, we had to prove a safety case. It was an advantage to use the resources of GB Railways, and a commercial launch was planned. We started with 27 staff. By 2020, the company employed 127. All were recruited locally in Hull, where we also established our company office. This was a deliberate strategy, as was the company's name, to promote a very singular identity with the city. It has proved to be the linchpin of the company's success. There remains an almost symbiotic relationship between staff and customers and between the city and the company. Within a year, Hull Trains achieved record-breaking customer satisfaction ratings with fewer than 1% having any adverse comment. A 2003 editorial in the Hull Daily Mail stated that Hull Trains was, quote, a huge success story for the city, leading the way in the railway industry with its excellent performance, ending, well done, Hull Trains. The city whose name you carry is proud of your achievements. Of course, it wasn't all unalloyed joy. Within a month of service launch, tragedy struck in the shape of the Hatfield disaster. This was followed by other events: major flooding of the Lower Aire Valley, the Great Heck tragedy, and Potter's Bar, all of which massively disrupted operations for extended periods. We were able to keep going with the support of GB Railways, and in time, things settled down. The future successful development of the company was assured. Our first year recorded a turnover of less than 1.5 million and a loss of almost the same amount. We carried only 80,000 passengers, but by 2003, a turnover of nearly 7 million and profit of 500,000 were achieved. We carried 300,000 passengers. By the time I left the board in 2014, we were carrying over 750,000 passengers, and the million mark was reached in 2018. In 2020, the company's turnover exceeded 32 million. The early growth boosted our confidence. The Hull flow itself grew more than any other long-distance flow to London from anywhere in the country, encouraging us to seek further train paths. Frequencies were improved. A new park and ride facility was opened at Howden in the East Riding, and Retford was added to the mix south of Doncaster, in addition to existing stops at Grantham, where Hull services provided more seats for London commuters. Within 5 years, the company was running 7 weekday trains each way between Hull and London. An extension to Beverley was added in 2015. Meanwhile, Grand Central had entered the fray with an application to run Transpennine services, which I counselled the promoter to drop, convinced that the opportunity to generate a strong business didn't exist, something the regulator agreed with when plans were submitted. I was pleased that Grand Central then shifted to the Hull Trains model by developing London operations from Bradford and Sunderland. A sign of the increasing appetite of the regulator for competition was its approval for these services, and they began to produce data from open access routes to demonstrate the passenger benefits, a position that was becoming increasingly favourable. None of this was going down well in the boardroom of Sea Containers, owners of GNER. Motivated by the protectionist instincts that loomed large in the new world of private train companies, they did at last play the see you in court card. They questioned the legality of a regulator decision that enabled Grand Central to expand its activities. A challenge in the form of a judicial review was taken to the Royal Courts of Justice in 2006, and Hull Trains was named an interested party. GNR's case was dismissed. This was probably the single most important development affecting the future of open access operations, as it provided greater certainty for investors and meant that specious challenges from franchised operators were less likely to be made. Open access became an accepted presence on the East Coast route. Subsequent capacity studies and infrastructure works were designed to accommodate the assumption that one such service would operate hourly through the day. In 2007, Hull exceeded 20 million in revenue and recorded a profit of nearly 4.5. We began to explore other opportunities on the East Coast Main Line. Initially, we modelled a limited stop semi-fast operation between King's Cross and Lincoln via the joint line, with extensions to Grimsby and Cleethorpes, before starting detailed work on a Harrogate service via York, including park and ride at Cattle Station near the A1. We were frustrated by the regulator's decision to instead grant an application to National Express, who had taken over from GNER on the East Coast, and who offered open access services initially via Leeds. Ironically, the subsequent failure of that franchise was the cause of the Harrogate operations being placed within the parameters of a new franchise specification, an example of the authorities benefiting from the entrepreneurial activities of others. The success of Hull Trains also caused Mike and I to explore opportunities away from the East Coast Main Line, where we were bound by a non-compete clause in the shareholders' agreement with GB Railways. As Renaissance Trains, we explored in depth, but did not pursue, services between Nottingham, Leeds and Glasgow, and others between Glasgow, Liverpool and Blackpool. But we did soon settle on what looked like another decent prospect, Wrexham and Shropshire. For a number of years, I had been a non-executive director of Lang Rail, operators of the Chiltern franchise, and formed the view that in Adrian Shooter, the company had a managing director with the vision and determination to pursue innovative operations, including open access. Langs had recently decided to opt out of the latest round of franchises because the risk of failure no longer justified the expense of bidding. They were more receptive to open access. Plans focused on running 5 trains a day each way between London Marylebone and Wrexham, calling principally at Wolverhampton, Telford and Shrewsbury. The revenue case relied on a timetable that minimised journey times. A memorandum of understanding was signed in February 2006, followed by a public announcement in the areas to be served. In November, we made a formal application to the Office of Rail Regulation to support a track access agreement with Network Rail, the successor organisation established following Railtrack's demise 4 years earlier. There was substantial stakeholder support for our proposals, and the Welsh Government went so far as to fund Network Rail infrastructure at Wrexham that would enable trains to stable there overnight. The regulator approved a 7-year concession starting in December 2007. The following month, the key event occurred that would be critical to a later decision to abandon operations in 2011. The Lang Group who'd been bought out by merchant bankers, sold its rail interest to the German state railway company, Deutsche Bahn. It became quickly apparent that DB's very centrist, may I say stereotypically Germanic approach, was the opposite of what was required of an open access operator. Their house style was a state-owned leviathan, not that of a nimble commercial operator. This proved catastrophic for the fledgling company when early results fell short of the initial business plan forecasts. The reason for this are several and complex, and probably too many to cover in this address. There's a good book on the subject which I can recommend. It's called Wrexham and Shropshire, Open Access, The One That Got Away, written by Richard Harper and Gordon Rushton. The main reason for the failure was that just as with Hull Trains in the early stages, Network Rail and Virgin Trains' actions protected the larger operators' interests, with the result that the timetable we ended up with involved significant hold-ups en route. A wholly avoidable time penalty of around 20 minutes was the killer blow and reduced the attractiveness of the service. This was compounded by a successful assault on our Wolverhampton stop by Virgin Trains. The regulator supported them on the grounds that the original track access agreement for the West Coast franchise precluded competition from any one of their provincial stations to any, I pause to repeat it, any London terminus. So Wolverhampton Marylebone was disallowed. Consequently, Wrexham and Shropshire was forced to consider other options in the Black Country, and we chose Tame Bridge Parkway, situated equidistantly between Walsall and West Bromwich, on the line between Wolverhampton and Stetchford that avoids Birmingham New Street. These were large boroughs with a socio-economic profile very similar to Hull. Yet within 2 years, and despite our best efforts, we were falling short of the revenue plan, and DB took fright. Within another 2 years, the service was reduced to a token level, and the operation was abandoned altogether in 2010. At the time, WSMR was achieving the highest passenger satisfaction scores of any train company in the country, and despite the obstacles it faced, I was of the view that it would have been breaking even within a year to 18 months. I also thought that the Wolverhampton restriction would be overcome through the application of wider competition law. If I had been heading a company like DB, with a multi-billion euro turnover, which owned a company that had such phenomenal scores, I would have been using them in all my marketing and promotional material, especially if I was in the business of bidding for other franchises, not just in the UK, but internationally. It was inept of DB that they did not do so. We had challenged the timetable offered by Network Rail and appealed to the Industries Disputes Committee. It judged that WSMR had been wrongly treated, but that in essence it was by then too late to do anything about it, as a major recast of services throughout the area and on the West Coast Main Line had by then been announced. We appealed to the regulator, who supported Network Rail, but nonetheless agreed that we had been wrongly treated. This was another example of the difficulties open access operators faced. It appeared that all the major industry bodies were at best unfriendly and at worst hostile. Ironically, 2 years after the closure of the company, I had a conversation with the then head of the Office of Rail Regulation, who confessed that allowing Virgin's objection was probably the worst decision that was made in his time. Ironically, but perhaps predictably, the enforced failure of WSMR ended well for the Shropshire stations previously abandoned by the DfT and the franchise operators. London train services were restored from Shrewsbury and Telford under the terms of new franchise agreements, and the traction and rolling stock acquired and renovated by Wrexham and Shropshire can still be found operating much improved Chiltern railway services between Birmingham Moor Street and Marylebone in competition with the West Coast operator. Meanwhile, I was offered the opportunity to get involved in Germany, where a company was created to become a major competitor of DB. I admit to being tempted, in part because it would have been satisfying to have a go at DB following the WSMR experience. But the market conditions were so different that I judged my involvement would not really add much value. I'm nonetheless pleased to see that DB now faces competition in its home markets from open access operators. Back home, Hull Trains was turning over just shy of 30 million, with profits of around 4.5 million in 2014. We'd also developed a privately funded electrification scheme for the final section of route between Hull and the East Coast Main Line at Templehurst Junction near Selby. We did this in conjunction with the engineering company Amy, with whom we intended to establish a joint venture for the construction of the infrastructure. The business case rested on the introduction of lighter, electric, high-speed trains and the presumption that the new infrastructure could also be used by Transpennine services, providing the last leg of what was then a network rail proposal to complete electrification between Manchester and Selby, a scheme that would have left Hull isolated. The electrification scheme justifies a lecture in itself, but as there is no time to go into detail today, it will suffice to say that it didn't receive enough support from Network Rail, and unwilling to countenance an inordinate delay to a scheme that was seen as vital to the company's future, the Hull board decided instead to invest in 5 Class 808 hybrid trains, which came into phased operation between December 2019 and February 2020. I had remained a board director of Hull Trains until 2014, when Mike and I, quite unexpectedly, sold our shares to First Group. The share sale, whereby First Group acquired full ownership of Hull Trains, was an interesting turn of events in itself. At that time, First was bidding for the East Coast franchise and believed that competition rules required it to dispose of Hull Trains in the event of winning bid. This bore some similarities with the same group's acquisition of Hull Trains in 2003, when it came as part of the GB Railways package to acquire the Anglia franchise. Both deals reflected the greater security then attributed to franchise contracts rather than open access. The same might be said today, where government service contracts have been substantially de-risked and represent a small margin but a predictable high-value activity over the contract term. What will happen in the future is unknown and therefore problematical, but it is significant that people are looking again at Wrexham and Shropshire, and that First Group has continued to develop the open access market with the creation of its Lumo brand. This reflects its confidence in understanding the parameters of the market in which open access can operate and offers a hedge against the risks and cost of bidding for government contracts, not to say the increasing domination that government has over the running of the operation. As an aside, First did not win the East Coast franchise, possibly a blessing because it went instead to Virgin Trains, whose bid was overtaken by reality and was terminated in 2018. At the time of acquiring full ownership of Hull Trains, the net value of open access to First Group's total rail portfolio was disproportionately greater than the franchise that it then held. There was one year, admittedly a bad one, when Hull Trains accounted for about a third of the whole of First Group's profits. First Group's Lumo high-speed operation between King's Cross and Edinburgh began in 2021 and exemplifies the benefit of securing access rights to operate a passenger train company with no influence from the DfT. They have a track access agreement and regulatory approval to 2031, a very satisfactory 10-year period, with the possibility, if Hull is anything to go by, of future extensions subject to demonstrating satisfactory performance and investing in company facilities and services. Assuming also that Hull Trains complies with the terms of its access agreement, that company will have been in operation continuously for 32 years. The long-term value to shareholders of open access should not be underestimated. Open access has been facilitated by a review of East Coast capacity and recognition by the authorities that it is to be encouraged. This was a major turnaround in thinking in the privatisation era, for most of which the DfT had mainly resisted the idea, but which the regulator increasingly supported. It was boosted when the Competition and Markets Authority entered the debate in 2015 with a thoroughgoing review into passenger railways. I was one of many whose views were canvassed at the time. It concluded that benefits to passengers could be realised by a greater liberalisation of the market through open access, also through the letting of competing franchises, or a combination of the two. I have in the past written about the idea of competing franchised operations, and I'm still warm to the idea. Generally speaking, it is practical on long-distance routes and probably worthy of consideration. What has changed since 2015, though, is the financial and market environment for railways and public services more widely. The current and prospective financial woes facing the country have sparked a renewed interest in the potential for private sector investment on the one hand and the tighter allocation of public funds on the other. We see this today in ongoing disputes, not just with the rail unions, but with those in other public services, notably health. Given the changes in travel patterns provoked by COVID-19, in particular working from home and a reduction in both commuter and business rail travel, there has been a reversal in the traditional breakdown of passenger journeys. This is likely to remain the pattern for the foreseeable future. Leisure travel is now the growth area. Much of it is long distance, the market segment most amenable to competing operations, acting as a stimulus for a number of passenger improvements in fares and in customer service. These are also the routes where traffic levels have recovered quickest following the pandemic. Passenger journeys on Hull trains are now running at their highest ever levels, whilst LNER was the first major company to exceed pre-pandemic levels. It is the East Coast Main Line on which this story has been played out. And as the first open access operator, Hull Trains can undoubtedly claim to have been the catalyst for the subsequent growth that has taken place on it. Whether we see more of it in the future will, of course, depend on many factors, government policy being the most important. It is currently impossible to define how the result of the next general election might affect open access, or indeed any other element in the railway matrix. You would imagine that the Conservatives might be expected to be the most supportive, but I wouldn't count on that. Where public spending is concerned, Tory governments have often acted counter to their free market philosophies. In the case of open access, when they perceived that it was siphoning off revenues from publicly supported franchises, for example. You might think Labour would be less sympathetic to open access, but it was the Blair government that accepted the Tory privatisation and gave its support to Hull Trains. The most supportive was Alan Johnson, a cabinet minister and the MP for Hull West. Whether the Deputy Prime Minister, John Prescott, also a Hull MP, was instrumental, I cannot say, but it certainly happened on his watch. As to Starmer's Labour Party, we don't know yet. There's continuing talk about renationalisation, but not, one senses, in its traditional form. Would open access survive? Who knows? Would the idea of computing franchises appeal? I don't suppose anyone's given it much thought, but they will have to, and when they get to understand the complexities and the contracting matrix that surrounds open access, they will be likely to make pragmatic rather than dogmatic decisions. We shall see. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you for that. I think, well, the sort of immediate impression listening to John, and I've always thought this, that sort of privatisation, which was a political, if you like, idea, but we finished up with what could be described in 3 words, a can of worms. And I have to hand it to John that he decided to jump into this can of worms. And from what we've heard today, he has managed to sort of disentangle 1 or 2 of the worms, straighten them out, and we did finish up with some straight worms which ran from places like Hull and Wrexham. So I just think it's ironic, really, that what started off as, if you like, competition and privatisation, that what we eventually finished up with at one stage was a privatised organisation which is being run, or was being run, by state-owned railway companies from Europe and certainly with the freight in the United States and Germany. So I'm sure all of you have got something to say about this. Railways are always a sort of topic that people have been interested in this country, and I think since privatisation there's been lots of food for thought, lots of complaints. So would anybody like to ask John a question about it? Yes. Should I come round?
I can hear you. Yep. Yes, yes, I can hear you. They are now, yes. Ironic, isn't it? That's right. Hull trains, the 180s were part of a deal which First Group, I'm talking about Hull trains first of all, were part of a deal that First Group did with the Department for Transport, who at the time wanted to get hold of our much superior Pathfinder trains, which were superb trains, the ones that I referred to in my talk. And this does kind of come to the point about the extent to which franchise operating companies like First Group are in hock to the Department for Transport. And there's an element of blackmail involved that if in this particular case they didn't do what the Department for Transport wanted them to do, which was to transfer these trains to the Midland Main Line to operate a service to Corby from St Pancras, then any bids that they might be making elsewhere might be, shall we say, might not be favourably looked upon. So this was a deal that was done by the then Managing Director of First Group, a chap called Moyle Lockhead, direct with the Department of Transport, which resulted in Hull Trains, because of course they were the majority shareholder on Hull Trains, and Mike and I as minority shareholders opposed the idea of transferring these trains, but of course we couldn't force that decision. So we ended up with the 180 trains. And when we had the 180 trains, they were the most unreliable trains that Hull Trains had ever had. So it's no surprise to me that Grand Central have experienced that continuing problem. I think if you have a very small fleet of trains, and that you only have a single maintenance facility for those trains, which obviously they have, only got one, the likelihood of them being maintained to a high standard is quite low. Where you've got a subset of a fleet that is part of a much bigger fleet that is being maintained as a much bigger fleet, then I think you have got a chance. And at least when First Group had them, they were part of a 180 fleet that First Group had based at Old Oak Common. So it wasn't as bad as it might have been, but it was still pretty bad. Sorry, I missed the first part of the question.
HS2.
Oh, HS2.
The decision. So sorry, I know it's nothing to do with your talk, but it's a live issue, or possibly a dead issue, I don't know. But I'd very much like your views on how big decisions like that should be taken, probably not just before the election in 2010 or today.
Well, I've written articles about HS2 at the time of its initiation and subsequently, but at the time of its gestation, I was not known as a supporter of it, I'm afraid, and I find in some railway circles that makes me a deeply unpopular figure. But the reason I was not so in favour of it was because I was instead in favour of what is now being talked about, which is a high-speed link across the north of the country from Liverpool to Hull and York, which I thought was a much more useful, economically generative prospect than linking Manchester and Leeds to London via Birmingham. And I thought that at the time, and therefore, of course, I would still have thought that today, but of course time has moved on, and we've now got the thing built halfway. So the question is, do you carry on or do you not? And I've no doubt in my own mind that you should carry on. We can argue why I think that, but I think we should carry on. I think it was a very big mistake, however, by the Johnson government previously to have decided to not complete properly the leg to Leeds, because given that the whole idea of HS2 is to regenerate parts of the northern economy, to do so only on the west side of the country and not on the Yorkshire side of the country seems to me to be manifestly unfair and almost ridiculous. So I have very mixed views about whether this should continue to Manchester or not. Obviously it should, because why would you invest in such infrastructure so far and not complete it? But I do feel that the imbalance of East and West is a very serious problem for the future. I also felt that the routing of the HS2 in the first place could have been different. I felt myself that they should have looked at a possible route that was common as far as Sheffield and then triangulated from Sheffield to Manchester, possibly via the old Woodhead kind of routing, and to Leeds. And I think if you'd done that, you could have had a triangular situation which also could have improved the Transpennine situation between East and West. So I think the whole thing has been very badly planned, very badly handled. I'm not close enough to its management to know why it has exploded in terms of the costs and so on. You probably know about as much of that as I do. I mean, I just read what I read in the papers. But I think it's a tragedy what's happened.
Any more questions?
Bill.
Could you say where you think the next private operator should be going to? In other words, the Blackpool Euston thing failed, obviously because of COVID, one would imagine. But where would you suggest that was a suitable opportunity for the next open access operator to have a look at?
I think I have to be honest here. I don't myself think that open access as we have known it up to present is really the model for going forward. I think a far more interesting idea is the idea of franchises being broken down into more manageable parts. You can call that open access, you can call it franchising. I don't care what you call it, but basically operations on any line of route that are focused on not necessarily tiny markets, but on specific markets are more likely to be successful than those that are kind of regionalized or too big, basically. So I think open access tells you that small is good, but there aren't at the moment, I think, many examples of where that could apply given the franchising specifications that exist. I think if the government were prepared to review the extent to which those specifications needed to be let by the government or could be bid for by other companies, I think it might open up opportunities. So, for example, you could see an East Coast operator operating to Edinburgh from Scotland. You could see an East Coast operator operating to Leeds. They could be different companies. There would be elements where they would overlap and could compete with each other. And you can see that on other routes as well. You can see that probably on parts of the Great Western. But I don't think there are any specific elements of the railway system at the moment that you would look at and say, that area is not well served, open access has got a chance. Whereas I think open access initially, Hull certainly, and Wrexham and Shropshire to some extent, and then Grand Central, what they looked at were parts of the railway that were not well served, or indeed served at all really, but which, if they were to be served, would offer the possibility of a decent business. And I don't think there are many of those at the moment, to be perfectly honest. Sorry to be disappointing.
Informed by the British decision to separate infrastructure from operations to encourage competition, or was it the other way around? Was the government influenced by what the EU was saying?
It's a good question. It's one I've often asked myself and never actually come up with a satisfactory answer, I'm afraid. But I think we came first. So I think it was done here first. Obviously, because things happen very slowly in the EU, so I imagine it was being talked about within the EU at the same time. But I don't believe that was the reason why the government decided to do it that way. The reason they decided to do it that way was the reason I gave in my address. But open access has become, and competition has become, quite significant in parts of the European network.
So I don't want to get too involved in HS2, but I've consistently said on the west side of the Pennines, that is where most of Britain lives. 3 million's in the West Midlands, 6 million in Lancashire, 500,000 or so around Stoke-on-Trent, and much of West Scotland and North Wales. It's desperately short, 2 tracks out of Euston to at least around the Crewe area, I would have thought was essential. What happens north of there, we can discuss. My knowledge of South Manchester and its suburbia and the politics of that, I don't want to go into, but as someone who's always lived in Sheffield, seeing not having Midland Main Line electrified to Sheffield and Leeds via Derby. So at least cross-country trains could use electric train probably from Birmingham northwards up to Scotland. It is ridiculous. If you sit in Sheffield Station, you've got those damned Voyagers and Midland whatevers they are. Their engines are driving your ears down. We need to have the Midland Main Line electrified. That should be the main priority. The population along the East Midlands, South Yorkshire into West Yorkshire, is higher than anywhere else. So actually, the reason I was going by coincidence, I happened to have got my 2006 first Platform 5 fleet book, which shows the Class 180 Adelantes, actually when they were in First Great Western. There is a livery, and there is one in here if anybody wants to look at it. But let's say that's more of an observation, so...
Yes, gentlemen, the front door. I presume that the limit of 1.5 retained profits applies as much to open access as it is to what used to be the franchises, now management contracts.
No.
So what is the situation?
No, they just
Is
drop.
it now an even playing field so far as profit levels are? The maximum profit levels are concerned under management contract?
No. They operate just as normal commercial companies in any other sphere of industrial life. They either make a profit or they make a loss. I mean, I've got somewhere a slide which would show you the years in which Hull Trains made losses and those in which they made profits, but it didn't start to make long-term profits for about probably 3 years. They're very high-risk activities, actually. I think a lot of people in the industry feel the opposite. But actually, when you're sitting around the table of a company like that, you do realise that these are very risky ventures, particularly when something like Hatfield happens, and you've got nowhere to go. And we were fortunate, really, that we got into bed with GB Railways because they did have the financial resources to keep us afloat while those disasters occurred. Otherwise, I think the thing would have gone out of business very quickly.
Hull Trains use the diversionary route to St Pancras on occasions.
I'm not up to date. Remember, I left the board a number of years ago. I don't know what they do now, but I know that they had rights into Liverpool Street, for example.
Yes, they do run on occasions into...
They do run
St
occasionally
Pancras,
via
yes.
Cambridge, yeah.
No, via Sheffield and down the
Okay.
Midland Main Line.
Well, you have more knowledge than I have.
Yes. I didn't know whether Hull Trains drivers are route trained or whether they have to...
I don't believe they are, but they might be.
All right, thank you.
Any more questions? Yes, Graham?
Thanks. Just on that point, actually, I mean, it's interesting that Hull Trains and I think Grand Central managed to still operate a train through when there's engineering work on the East Coast Main Line, and yet LNER don't, and tip people out into buses or make them go to Bedford and get a train from there and all this messing about, which really is just, I think, unacceptable in the current situation. I just wondered if you had a thought about that.
Well, I tend to agree with you. I mean, the only difference, of course, is that theirs is a much bigger scale operation. And it's probably easier to squeeze a small scale operation through in situations like that than it is a large scale one. But you'll notice that Hull Trains are not on strike. And I don't think Grand Central are on strike either. And that should tell you something about the current dispute with the government-owned companies. Why is that? Because they've got the commercial freedom. I think it gives the lie to the fact that the government is not behind the train companies' actions in the dispute.
Right, well, I've just changed the slide. This is the programme for the North East Group, which has been responsible for organising this event today. So I'm going to give them a little bit of publicity. And up on the screen are the events that they are organising through the winter months. The meetings are held at either York Library, or they are going to have, I think, 2 or 3 done on Zoom. For those of you that don't know York, the library is located in Museum Street, and if you're interested in attending, log on to the RCHS website. The website address is shown at the bottom, rch.org.uk. Also, our society. We have, for the purpose of this meeting, done this little business card which tells you on the size of a postage stamp virtually, because they are getting bigger, postage stamps, what we are and what we're about. I'm sure most of you are here today know what we are and what we're about. But anyway, if anybody is a visitor, then please log on to our website and you'll see what we're up to. There are lots of events. We are regional, so although this meeting is taking place in York, people are quite welcome from other areas to come here, or people from here can go to Northwest, Southwest, West Midlands, and the London group. There's a small collection of our books outside for sale, but again, you can organise books online. I would like to thank Nick Higton and his colleagues from North East Group for all the time and effort they've spent in organising this event today. As I said at the beginning, it's a big disappointment because a lot of people put in a lot of hard work to publicise this event, and we were looking to have a big audience, but thank you for those of you who've come. Finally, can I thank John Nelson for his talk. It's been most interesting, and obviously privatisation, open access, franchising, we could probably talk about that subject until midnight and still not sort it out. But anyway, thank you very much, John, for that. Much appreciated. So could we have a round of applause for North East and for John? And just as a small token, I'm going to present John. He probably doesn't wear ties now, but if you ever ask Paul to, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Safe journey home, and look forward to seeing you hopefully at next year's Clinker Lecture, wherever that might be. Thank you.